we always save one speaker for our final speaker. And the way we kind of think about this position in the lineup is that we want to bring somebody here that sends us home in a good way with something that grounds us and something that inspires us. And when we thought of the name right away, we knew Tamara would do that for us. And a thinker, a philosopher, a writer, a powerful, powerful advocate for Indigenous people, and someone that positions herself as a strong Indigenous woman first and kind of writes and thinks from that place. And so we're really, really honored to have Tamara Starblanket here with us as our final speaker here at Think Indigenous 2018. She's from Matatakup First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. She holds an LLM from the University of Saskatchewan and an LLB from the University of British Columbia. She teaches and coordinates the Aboriginal Justice Studies program at the Native Education College. She was recently elected co-chair of the North American Indigenous Peoples Caucus. She's a former director of policing and research and development at the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. We are proud and honored to introduce to you, please put your hands together for Tamara Starblanket.
Thank you. I just want to say good afternoon to everyone, and I really would like to first give thanks and gratitude to the Great Spirit for this day, for life, for my life. I would also like to thank Think Indigenous for inviting me here today. I'm honored to be here, and to the University of Saskatchewan College of Education Indian Teacher Education Program. Hi, for inviting me here today. My name is Tamara Starblanket. My spirit name is Ojapi Gisisqueo, and I'm originally from this territory, and I come from the Atakaku band of the Cree Nation. That's how I like to describe it, because I think we're a bigger, we're a part of the larger Cree Nation. And I have, so just to tell you a little bit about myself and where I come from. However, I was also raised, when my mother left residential school, she took us and raised, part of my life was raised on the West Coast. So that's where I presently reside. And again, I don't have any notes. It looks like I have notes, but I don't. It's just for some quotes that I would like to read off. And when Chris asked me through a phone call a few months ago about this conference and to speak here, he asked me what I would speak about. And today I would like to address the truth. And, but mainly it's about, I have a forthcoming book on genocide that will be released, that will go to print probably late next week. And so what I'm going to present to you today is that work, or just give a brief overview of what my work is about. And so yes, so just to let you know also as well that my work is not a product of scholarly detachment. My work really is about, it kind of tells my family story, but not just my family story, so many different families and nations on Turtle Island, and what we've experienced since the colonial invader or settler has arrived in our territories, wherever that is, but not just on Turtle Island, globally around the world. This is the colonial project, it's sometimes referred to as. And so I don't like to have a plan as to what I'm going to say. I always just like to speak from my heart. And so this is how I'm going to present my information to you today. So I guess first off, I don't have a title, but I did use a title that I've cited in my own work. And the title of this presentation is Genocide is Genocide, no matter what form it takes and no matter what you call it. And that comes from Sharon Ben, Dr. Sharon Ben, in a book that she had, in a foreword to one of Ward Churchill's readings. And so that's what I want to open up with today, is that phrase, because no matter how you look at what we've experienced on Turtle Island, it has been a genocidal experience. And what I've learned about colonialism is that at the end product of colonialism is genocide. And so part of the challenge actually my work is based on my dissertation. And some of the legal question that I examine in my work is, one, whether the Canadian state is guilty for crimes of genocide, and two, which wasn't really, I hadn't planned on it, but it turned out to be a finding, but it started off questioning what is the legal meaning of the Canadian Criminal Code. And so out of that comes this understanding that the state of Canada also violates customary international laws on genocide. So there's no way that I could get through my entire research in the time that I have, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what that's about. And so when I said earlier on that my work is not a product, or it's not based on scholarly, it's not coming from a Western academic perspective, is what I'm trying to say here. And why I say that is because when I was drafting and researching my dissertation, it took me 7 years. And through that, I ran into some challenges along the way, and Mylan Tusis referred to some of that. And really, it's not just a problem here. It's a very the problem is massive, actually. The Western Academy likes to deny that what they've done here is genocide. And what they do is they like to deny also that it's a crime of genocide, what they've done to our nations and our peoples. And so, and in that, in developing my legal arguments, I had some challenges, but in the end, my committee agreed with me that a crime of genocide has taken place. And it not only took place, but what it shows is that the crime took place in the colonization process. And so let me read to you what Article 2 of the United Nations Genocide Convention says. So it's framed as being any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And so there's 5 parts to this. There's A, killing members of the group; B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group; C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part; and D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group; and also E, finally forcibly transferring the children of the group to another group. And so today, that is the present Genocide Convention. And what I learned when I was researching the topic, what I've learned is that when the United Nations, when the crime of genocide was being drafted through international law, there were world governments that were involved in that drafting process. And some of them was the United Kingdom, and Canada, the United States. And so what happened was really there was just an objective to remove cultural genocide from the Genocide Convention. And so what that means legally is I understood when I was researching and writing my document that I couldn't frame my legal argument around those kind of, I couldn't frame it as a loss of language or culture. Or I couldn't frame it I couldn't frame the destruction as cultural genocide, basically, because the government such as Canada took it out. And I'll tell you that Canada, that was the only point that they opposed when they were drafting the Genocide Convention. What they had wanted, they had threatened a reservation if cultural genocide was to remain in the Genocide Convention. However, it didn't, but they did threaten a reservation. And so So what that means again is that I could not frame it using those types of words. And so what I needed to understand was to create another way of describing what that, what this colonial project is, or how to frame it as genocide. And so probably 2008, maybe 2008, I had attended a treaty meeting in Muscatcheese, and there was an elder that was present there, and he talked about his concern was that there was too many young people that were well, in his own words, he talked about brainwashing, that our young people were brainwashed, that his concern was that they didn't think and didn't speak in their own languages. So I knew at that point, in that early stage of the research, that I was going to frame the destruction using that, but I still didn't know how I was going to go from there. And so then in 2009, I had the great fortune of meeting the late Miguel Alfonso Martinez in a workshop on self-determination. And he had heard about the work that I was undertaking, and he had told me at that time, well, I'll share it. He had told me at that time to be careful. He said, be careful, Tamara, not to domesticate your legal arguments, not to frame your legal arguments so that basically that you trap your people to the Canadian state. And but also, I mean, I was already aware of that before he described what I'm going to share to you. But again, that was an affirmation for me that I needed to really think about how I was going to frame this legal argument. And so then later, he talked about what Indigenous peoples experienced all over the world. He talked about it as demonization. He talked about it as isolation. And he also referred to it as destruction. And he said it didn't just happen here in Canada, Tamara, it happened all over the world, what happened. So I knew at that point, then I thought, okay, well, I'm going to use that, because we need another way to describe what's happened to us. And so that is the beginning of this model that's been developed in this work. And it's called the model of domination and dehumanization. And it's based on Stephen Newcomb's Pagans in the Promised Land, Decoding the Christian Doctrine of Discovery. And Mr. Stephen Newcomb's work is groundbreaking because he talks about this domination and dehumanization and how that domination has been encoded into this colonial language that we all speak in. And I'll admit too that I don't speak my language fluently. I don't think in my language either. So, and I've often wondered what that would be like to be able to think in our own original languages, how I would look at the world if I could think like a Nehiyaw person or a woman, a Squayo. So this is part of the problem. It's the language and the words. So when you look back to what I said at the beginning about genocide is genocide, no matter what form it takes and no matter what you call it, it is. And so when this model of domination and dehumanization that was developed, what it does two things. It takes colonialism and it unpacks it, or turns the table on itself, and it also compels the Western reader or the denier of genocide that what we've experienced is genocide. Because I tell you, I attended some genocide conferences, and those are the worst, by the way, because what I experienced firsthand were people that were denying that the residential school was a genocidal process. And in these conferences that I attended, I had to debate with people, and it was appalling to me to have to debate with these scholars that what our children went through in those places was a destructive genocidal process. And so and further to that, how do I explain that? You have to excuse me, those lights are bright, and it's hard to look at them. I'm trying to look off to the side here, and it's a bit distracting. I've never spoke to a group this large, and yeah, so it's a bit nerve-wracking up here. Just so you know. Yeah. Yeah. And so when you look at the concept of cultural genocide, then I couldn't explain it that way. So then what I did, so going back to that definition I read to you, the UNGC, or the United Nations Convention on Genocide, what I did was I decided to take not just one article, Article E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, but then I also decided that I would add in that the forcible transferring of our children causes the collective serious bodily and mental harm to children. And then in this process, going back to the model of domination and dehumanization, you know, I'm not an English, I don't have an English background, so I didn't realize that I had developed a metaphor. I didn't know until I read Stephen Newcomb's work, and that's why this was important. So what that model becomes is a metaphor for a brainwashing machine. And what it does is it takes the work of many different people, Ward Churchill, it takes the work of Roland Christian, and it also, you know, once you actually reveal the language for what it is, so let's look at words like abuse, mistreatment, and neglect. And that kind of terminology is actually, you know, academia is riddled with that kind of terminology. So when you look at the RCAP report, it talks about mistreatment. When you look at the apology by the Canadian government in 2008, that apology is loaded with rhetoric and euphemisms. And so I knew also, you know, in looking at the research based on what Roland Christian, Sherry Young, and Michael Moran had said in their circle game, that's all rhetoric. And what it does is it conceals genocide. That's why the language and how we frame things is very important, because when we try to frame things in language that renders it less than genocide, then it becomes easier for the colonizer to get away with it. It becomes easier for them to deny that what they've done here is a crime of genocide. And so when you look at, so this metaphor, this model of domination and dehumanization becomes a metaphor for that. So when you look at what happened to our children and our people, so I'm a survivor, I'm sorry, pardon me, I'm a product of that system. My mother's father, my grandfather, attended Thunderchild Residential School. My mother attended Prince Albert Indian Residential School. And on my dad's side, my late father's mother attended Birtle Indian Residential School. So, and then every family on Turtle Island has a different experience in how that affected us. And so we all, some were fortunate enough to be raised with their culture. I myself wasn't so very fortunate. I wasn't raised with my culture or nor my language. And so what we grew up with was living with what the book calls the long-term effects of genocide, or some people call that as intergenerational effects of genocide, or intergenerational effects of the residential school system. But what that really is their long-term impacts of genocide that are ongoing and that are still steamrolling over our people and over our nations. And so when you look at some of those long-term effects, are the suicides that has been addressed at this conference. Some of them are the drug and alcohol addictions. Some of those effects include massive and widespread depression and despair and sorrow and trauma. And so I'm sharing that because that was my experience. And I am the last person left of my family of birth. They passed on because of the things that I wrote about in my dissertation. and they're not here anymore. However, if it wasn't for them, and I want to say that here openly, if it wasn't for my late family, this work would never have been done. I would not have ever found the will or the purpose to complete the work and to prove what we've experienced here on Turtle Island as a crime of genocide. And so now when you get to my own personal experience with it, so this is why that metaphor is important. Because when you look at, what some of the scholarship out there talks about legacy, the legacy of the residential school system. Other words is they talk about it as intergenerational impacts or whatever they use. And when you use that kind of language to a person who's never been through it, so I'm talking about non-Indigenous people, but the non-Indigenous people that want to deny what they've done here. And yeah, some of them will say, well, that wasn't me, that was my grandparents, or that was my great-great-grandparents, or that was another government that did it. But what they fail to see is that is still going on with the child welfare system. They use the effects that they've created, that they caused. They use those effects and they forcibly remove, like we're at 48% of our children across Canada are Indigenous, Aboriginal children. And so yes, sometimes, when you're talking, or when I talk, I like to bring things to underneath all of the surface level stuff. That's where we need to get, is to get underneath all of that, because when we talk about the truth and what happened to us collectively on this continent, what we need to do is begin to understand how that has affected us and how that's still affecting us and what we need to do. And so this is what I think. So people talk about moving forward. Well, let's move forward. Well, how do we move forward when we're dealing with great trauma and great sorrow? And then further to that, with all due respect to people, I don't mean any disrespect. However, the government, there's a writer by Noam Chomsky calls it manufactured consent. Another writer by the name of Sharon Venn talks about this manufactured consent as well. But the state also uses the conditions they've created in our nations to manufacture the consent in all of these agreements that we have going on here. When you look at the land claims process, why would anybody claim, why would our nations claim land that already belongs to us? And by the way, this is unceded Treaty 6 territory, by the way. I live in Vancouver, and everybody over there likes to say, well, I'm thankful to be on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people. But I always think, well, yeah, over here too, this is unceded territory. None of it was ever surrendered over to the settlers and the Crown. So that's why this is important. I mean, I can't get into more than what I'm telling you here today, but I will tell you that the specific intent to destroy our nations has been proven. And so that would be because as nations, or as Nehiyaw or Anishinaabe peoples, who do we depend on? We depend on our children. We depend on our children to pass on and transmit the healthy characteristics and our spiritual identities onto further generations of our people. We depend on our children that much. But because of the residential school or the forcible transferring of our children from our nations and our peoples to the Canadian state in their residential schools and child welfare systems, because of those things, what we're transmitting is everything I've talked about, the trauma and the sorrow. And it's because of those conditions they created that we populate their prisons. We populate, again, the child welfare system. We populate every negative space of this colonial society. And so I say this, and I'm not trying to say this to bring everybody down or you know, but I think we need to have this discussion because we're not having this discussion or even globally, but even in Canada. We're not having this discussion. In my respectful view, we're not even having this discussion at all yet. You know, and then people want to talk about reconciliation. You know, Stephen Newcomb talks about means to do again. Conciliation means that there was former peaceful relationships. In my view, there has never, ever been any peaceful relationship here. No. There has never been, and it won't be until the colonizer looks within himself and examines his or own conduct. Because the more we continue to deny what has happened or what is continuing to take place, that this problem is never going away. And reconciliation, in my view, is just another word for genocide. It's another word for genocide, folks. So I shared my story a little earlier on because of everything that I've gone through in my life, I should be not here, standing here today, talking to you. But it's because of, first of all, it's because of the Great Spirit that I'm standing here. But second, it's because of my spiritual and cultural identity that was restored back to me. It was this work. Because when I started this work in 2007, I didn't know how to feel. I didn't know how to feel or even begin to address the catastrophic loss in my own family. But when I started this thesis on genocide, I began to actually find healing. This understanding heals like you will not believe. I can smile today, I can joke around, and I can laugh, and I'm actually in more peace than I ever was in my life. And so people are afraid of this because the truth hurts. But to the colonizer, I really think that what came over from that other side of the world was a lot of sickness and disease. And I say that with all due respect, because when you look at 1907, and people can try to deny this, but 1907, when Dr. Peter Bryce came out with his medical report, and he had talked about about 50% of children were not making out of the residential schools alive. And so this is like a chief medical officer of the Department of Indian Affairs. Yet what did the society do about it? There was a lawyer that took up the cause at that time, but it was in the Montreal Gazette. It made the news. But what had ended up happening is 1920, there was an amendment to the Indian Act, and the rights went through the roof. So I say this, again, with all due respect, but a society has to be sick to do that to innocent children. So now we have another system called the child welfare system, and children are being removed at catastrophic rates. So at some point, there has to be peace. And I know a little bit about, I don't know much about treaty actually, but I do know this, that I learned while I was talking to different elders and people about our treaties that, you know what affirms our national identities? First of all, the creation, but second, our treaties. They're international. And so when you look at what they didn't also just commit a crime of genocide. They've also violated our treaties. Because first of all, they didn't just violate the treaties by claiming that we ceded and surrendered over all of it, but they also stole our children. And they're still stealing our children. And I think that's where we need to begin to talk. We need to begin to talk openly with each other about what's happening, because that's the only way this is going to stop. And this is the only way there's going to be peace on this for us, but also for the colonizer too, the colonial settler people. Because don't you want there to be peace? And like, don't you want to stop? You know, so again, you know, I think about this work and it gave me a lot of, I feel a lot of love. I feel a lot of love for our nations, but all of our children. I have my grandchildren here today, and I'm really happy. You know, I'm a grandmother, and I have 2 sons as well. So I'm happy I'm alive, and I share this with you today in a good way. I want you to feel good about everything I've said here today. I didn't want to bring everything up to make everybody feel bad. But we have to start talking about the truth, and we have to begin to address this. And so part of it is stopping the genocide and all its various forms. I'm just only talking about the forcible removal of children. There's a whole gamut of other genocides that are being committed against our people. So many different acts of genocide out there that are going on right now. So it needs to stop. And I always hear from the different elders too, it's about implementing our treaties and really honoring the spirit and intent of those treaties, and quit trying to claim that you own our land, because you don't. You don't own any of it. So, hi, kinana skumtum, and thank you for listening to me, and thank you. Yeah. I was going to run out. Thank you.
Please keep your applause going for Tamara Starblanket, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much.